There are moments in war when time itself seems to fracture, when the chaos of battle compresses into a single heartbeat that stretches across eternity. On the blood-soaked beaches of Dunkirk, beneath skies torn apart by German Stukas and the desperate cries of 300,000 stranded souls, a young recruit named Thomas Brennan discovered that courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move forward when every fiber of your being screams for you to remain frozen. This is not merely a story of survival. This is the account of how one forgotten code, shouted across the inferno by a battle-hardened colonel, awakened something primal in a boy who had never fired his rifle in anger. Stay until the end, for within these words lies the truth that Winston Churchill himself understood when he declared that we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender. What you are about to witness is the transformation of terror into triumph, of paralysis into purpose, of a recruit into a soldier who would carry the weight of Dunkirk in his heart forever. The salt wind carried the stench of diesel fuel and death as Private Thomas Brennan stepped off the transport truck onto the outskirts of Dunkirk. He was 19 years old, had been in uniform for exactly 47 days, and had never seen a dead body until this moment. Now he saw dozens. They lay scattered across the cobblestones like discarded marionettes, their uniforms stained with the dark rust of dry blood, their faces frozen in expressions that would haunt his dreams. For decades to come, his hands trembled as he gripped his Lee-Enfield rifle, the weapon feeling impossibly heavy, impossibly foreign, as if it belonged to someone else entirely. Somewhere in the distance, artillery shells whistled through the gray morning air, each explosion sending tremors through the ground that he felt in his teeth, in his bones, in the very center of his chest, where his heart hammered with the relentless rhythm of pure terror. The date was May 29, 1940, and Operation Dynamo was entering its fourth desperate day. Colonel Edward Whitmore emerged from the smoke like a specter from another age of warfare. His uniform was torn, his face blackened with soot and grime, but his eyes, those pale blue eyes that had witnessed the trenches of the Somme and the gas attacks at Ypres, burned with an intensity that seemed to cut through the chaos surrounding them. He had been fighting for 23 years, had buried more friends than he cared to remember, and had learned that in the crucible of combat, men were either forged into steel or shattered into fragments. He assessed the young recruit in a single glance, noting the trembling hands, the wide eyes, the shallow breathing that spoke of a mind teetering on the edge of panic. He had seen it before, countless times. Some men found their courage, others never did. As Napoleon Bonaparte once observed, the battlefield is a scene of constant chaos, and the winner will be the one who controls that chaos. Whitmore intended to help this boy find his control, or watch him die trying. Sergeant Michael O'Brien was the third pillar of this unlikely trinity, a Dublin-born career soldier with 17 years of service etched into the weathered lines of his face. He possessed the dark humor that only those who have danced repeatedly with death can truly understand. He had survived Dunkirk's initial bombardment by diving into a crater filled with rainwater and corpses, had crawled through mud and fire to reach the defensive perimeter, and had already killed 11 German soldiers in close combat over the past 72 hours. His hands were steady as stone, his voice a low rumble that carried authority without ever needing to rise above the thunder of battle. He looked at young Brennan and saw himself, 20 years ago, standing in a different war, feeling the same terror, wondering if he would live to see another sunrise. Fortune favors the brave, the Romans used to say. O'Brien had learned that fortune also favored those who refused to stop moving. The German artillery barrage resumed at precisely 06:00 hours, the shells screaming overhead with a sound that Private Brennan would later describe as the wailing of demons being dragged back to hell. The three soldiers, the recruit, the colonel, and the sergeant, found shelter in a partially destroyed warehouse that had once stored fishing nets and now served as a makeshift casualty station. Wounded men lay everywhere, their groans and prayers creating a symphony of suffering that threatened to overwhelm Brennan's already fractured composure. A medic with blood-soaked hands worked frantically on a soldier whose leg had been reduced to a shattered ruin of bone and tissue, his movements mechanical, his face blank with the emotional detachment that comes from witnessing too much horror in too short a time. Colonel Whitmore moved through the carnage with practiced efficiency, offering words of encouragement to the wounded, making notes of ammunition supplies, calculating the odds of survival that grew worse with each passing hour. The evacuation fleet was coming, they said. The little ships were on their way, but the sea was 3 miles distant, and between them and salvation lay a gauntlet of German machine guns, dive bombers, and advancing infantry. The weather over Dunkirk had become an enemy in its own right. A thick fog rolled in from the English Channel, reducing visibility to mere meters, transforming the familiar landscape into a ghostly maze where shapes emerged and disappeared without warning. The fog muffled sound in strange ways, making distant explosions seem close and nearby voices seem to come from impossible directions. Brennan found himself jumping at shadows, his finger tightening on his trigger at every flicker of movement, his breath coming in short gasps that fogged in the cold morning air. His body was exhausted. He had not slept in 37 hours, but his mind refused to rest, cycling endlessly through scenarios of death and dismemberment, each more vivid and terrible than the last. Sergeant O'Brien noticed the young man's deteriorating state and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Listen to me carefully, lad," he said, his Dublin accent thick with fatigue but steady with conviction. "Fear is a fire. You can let it consume you, or you can use it to forge something stronger. The choice is yours, but you need to make it now, because in about 20 minutes, the Germans are going to hit us with everything they have. In the midst of chaos, there is also opportunity." Sun Tzu, the German assault came like a wave of gray-green death. Wehrmacht's soldiers advancing through the fog with disciplined precision, their Mauser rifles crackling in coordinated volleys that sent British defenders diving for cover. Colonel Whitmore stood at the center of the defensive line, his Webley revolver barking defiance at the advancing enemy, his voice rising above the chaos to direct fire and shore up faltering positions. Private Brennan found himself at a gap in the warehouse wall, his rifle pointed toward the fog, his finger frozen on the trigger as shapes materialized from the mist. Human shapes, enemy shapes, men who would kill him without hesitation if given the chance. He needed to fire. He knew he needed to fire. Every second of his brief training screamed at him to squeeze the trigger, to send the deadly projectile downrange, to defend his position and his comrades. But his finger would not move. His entire body had become a statue of flesh and terror, locked in a paralysis that no amount of willpower seemed capable of breaking. A German soldier emerged from the fog not 20 meters away, his rifle rising toward the young recruit, and still Brennan could not move, could not fire, could not do anything, but stare at his own approaching death with eyes wide and mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Sergeant O'Brien's rifle cracked twice in rapid succession, and the German soldier crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering harmlessly against the cobblestones. The Irishman grabbed Brennan by the collar and hauled him behind a stack of wooden crates, his face inches from the young recruit's terrified eyes. "That was your kill," he growled, his breath hot against Brennan's face. "The next one is on you, or we're both dead. You understand me?" But Brennan could only nod, his throat too constricted with fear to form words, his hands shaking so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on his rifle. The German assault intensified, more enemy soldiers pouring through the breaches in the perimeter, their shouts mixing with the screams of wounded men and the endless percussion of gunfire. Colonel Whitmore appeared at their position, his uniform now spotted with blood that might have been his own or might have belonged to someone else entirely. The evacuation point was being overrun, he reported. They needed to fall back, to fight their way to the beach, to somehow reach the boats that represented their only hope of survival. Brennan heard the words, understood their meaning, but remained frozen in place, his body refusing to obey the commands of his terrified mind. The retreat through Dunkirk's shattered streets became a nightmare of smoke and fire, of sudden ambushes and desperate firefights, of comrades falling and enemies appearing from every shadow. Colonel Whitmore led the way, his experience and instinct guiding them through a maze of rubble and burning vehicles, while Sergeant O'Brien brought up the rear, his rifle dealing death to any German soldier foolish enough to pursue too closely. Private Brennan moved between them like a sleepwalker, his legs carrying him forward through sheer momentum, while his mind remained trapped in a fog, thicker than any that rolled in from the channel. He had stopped thinking, stopped feeling, stopped being anything more than a terrified animal following the herd toward some dimly perceived safety. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming. His muscles burned with lactic acid, his lungs screamed for rest. His feet had long since gone numb inside boots soaked with blood and seawater. But the mental exhaustion was worse, a crushing weight that pressed down on his consciousness and threatened to extinguish the last flickering flame of his will to survive. As George S. Patton would later declare, "Fatigue makes cowards of us all." And Brennan was discovering the terrible truth of those words with every stumbling step. The streets of Dunkirk had become a graveyard of destroyed civilization. Shop windows that had once displayed bread and flowers now gaped like empty eye sockets, their contents looted or burned or simply buried beneath tons of rubble. A church steeple lay across the main thoroughfare, its ancient stones blocking the path and forcing the retreating soldiers to scramble over debris that shifted treacherously underfoot. Bodies were everywhere, British, French, Belgian, German, their nationalities rendered meaningless by the democracy of death that war imposes on all its participants. Brandon saw a young woman lying in a doorway, her dress still bright with colors that seemed obscene against the monochrome devastation surrounding her, her eyes staring sightlessly at a sky she would never see again. He wanted to stop, to cover her face, to offer some small dignity to this stranger caught in the crossfire of armies. She had never asked to fight, but Sergeant O'Brien pushed him forward, not cruelly but firmly, understanding that hesitation now meant death for all of them. The living have no time for the dead, the sergeant said, his voice heavy with a sorrow that belied his harsh words. We honor them by surviving. The beach at Dunkirk stretched before them like a vision from a fever dream, a vast expanse of sand crowded with the remnants of the British Expeditionary Force. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers waited in long, serpentine queues that stretched from the dunes to the water's edge, their discipline remarkable considering the circumstances, their patience tested by every screaming dive bomber that appeared from the smoke-filled sky. Small boats, fishing vessels, pleasure craft, tugboats, anything that could float and carry men shuttled between the beach and the larger ships anchored offshore, their crews working with desperate determination to rescue as many soldiers as possible before the German noose tightened completely. Colonel Whitmore surveyed the scene with the calculating eye of a veteran commander, assessing distances and timing, weighing risks against rewards, formulating plans that might give his small group a better chance of reaching the boats. The odds were not good. German aircraft controlled the skies, their Stukas diving with that terrible screaming sound that had become the soundtrack of defeat, their bombs and machine guns claiming lives with mechanical indifference. The water itself had become a killing ground, thick with oil and debris and the floating bodies of those who had almost made it to safety. Private Brennan collapsed onto the sand, his legs finally giving out after the grueling retreat through the city. His rifle fell from nerveless fingers, his vision swimming with exhaustion and dehydration, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. Around him, men waited with varying degrees of patience and despair, some praying quietly, others writing letters that might never reach home, still others simply staring at the horizon where England lay invisible beyond the gray waters of the Channel. The sound of aircraft engines grew louder, and Brennan watched with detached fascination as a formation of Stukas began their descent toward the beach, their distinctive gold-winged silhouettes like harbingers of doom against the smoke-stained sky. Sergeant O'Brien threw himself onto the young recruit, pressing him flat against the sand as bombs detonated in a line across the beach, sending geysers of sand and human remains into the air. The screaming of the wounded mixed with the howling of the aircraft and the thunder of explosions, creating a cacophony of destruction that seemed to have no end, no mercy, no possibility of survival. Courage is not having the strength to go on. It is going on when you don't have the strength. Theodore Roosevelt, the afternoon brought a crisis that would test the limits of human endurance. A German infantry assault broke through the perimeter at the eastern end of the beach, and suddenly enemy soldiers were among the waiting evacuees, their rifles and bayonets turning the orderly queues into scenes of chaos and slaughter. Colonel Whitmore rallied every man capable of holding a weapon, forming a desperate defensive line that bent but did not break under the German onslaught. Sergeant O'Brien fought like a man possessed, his rifle empty and forgotten as he engaged the enemy with bayonet and fists, his face contorted with a fury that transcended mere anger and approached something primal and elemental. But Private Brennan remained paralyzed, crouched in a shallow depression in the sand, his rifle clutched uselessly to his chest, his eyes watching the battle unfold with the disconnected horror of a spectator in a particularly gruesome theatrical production. He knew he should move, should fight, should do something to help his comrades who were dying all around him. But the fear had finally completed its work, had wrapped its cold fingers around his soul and squeezed until there was nothing left but a shell of flesh and bone and paralyzing terror. The German assault intensified as more enemy soldiers poured through the breach, their numbers overwhelming the hastily organized defense. Colonel Whitmore took a bullet through his left shoulder, but continued fighting, his Webley revolver speaking death with each trigger pull. his voice hoarse from shouting orders and encouragement. A young lieutenant fell beside Brennan, his chest torn open by a burst of machine gun fire. His dying eyes meeting the recruit's frozen gaze with an expression that seemed to ask why. Why are you not fighting? Why are you letting us die while you cower in the sand? The weight of that unspoken accusation pressed down on Brennan's consciousness, adding guilt to fear, shame to paralysis, creating a toxic mixture of emotions that threatened to destroy whatever remained of his sanity. The battle raged around him, men killing and dying in the eternal dance of combat. And still he could not move, could not act, could not become the soldier that his country and his comrades desperately needed him to be. David Goggins would one day write that suffering is the true test of life, and in that moment, Brennan was failing that test in the most fundamental way imaginable. It was in this moment of absolute darkness that Colonel Whitmore saw the frozen recruit and understood what needed to be done. He had witnessed this paralysis before, had seen strong men reduced to helpless statues by the overwhelming pressure of combat, had learned during his long years of warfare that sometimes the mind needed a key to unlock the prison of fear. He remembered a training exercise from decades ago, a forgotten protocol from the last war, a code phrase that was designed to shock soldiers out of their paralysis and restore their ability to function. It had been dismissed as psychological nonsense by the modern military establishment, relegated to the dustbin of outdated tactics and Victorian-era superstitions. But Whitmore had seen it work, once, on a young soldier in the trenches of Flanders who had been convinced that he was already dead. He pushed through the chaos of battle, ignoring the bullets that whipped past his head, the explosions that sent shrapnel singing through the air, until he stood directly in front of the cowering Private Brennan. The colonel grabbed the young man by his uniform, hauled him upright, and stared into those terrified eyes with an intensity that seemed to burn through flesh and bone, to reach the soul itself. "Still remembers," Whitmore shouted, his voice cutting through the noise of battle like a blade through silk. The words seemed to hang in the air, ancient and powerful, carrying with them the weight of generations of warriors who had faced their fears and overcome them. "Still remembers what flesh forgets. The blade knows nitrogen monoxide fear. You are the blade." Private Brennan's eyes widened, and something shifted in the depths of his consciousness. The words resonated with a part of him that he had not known existed, a primal core of strength that had been buried beneath layers of civilization and training, and the overwhelming terror of his first battle. He remembered his grandfather, a veteran of the Boer War, who had spoken of a time when soldiers carried more than weapons, they carried the spirits of all who had fought before them. He remembered his father, who had survived the Somme, who had told him that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He remembered every story of heroism and sacrifice that he had ever heard, every legend of warriors who had faced impossible odds and refused to yield. And in that moment of remembrance, the paralysis began to crack. The only easy day was yesterday. Navy SEAL modeled the transformation that occurred in Private Thomas Brennan was not gradual, but instantaneous, a switch flipping in the deepest recesses of his mind. His hands stopped trembling. His breathing steadied. His grip on his rifle shifted from desperate clutching to purposeful readiness. He looked at Colonel Whitmore with eyes that had changed, that had hardened, that now reflected the steel that the forgotten code had awakened within him. The fear was still there, it would always be there. He understood now, but it no longer controlled him. It had become fuel rather than anchor, driving force rather than paralyzing weight. He raised his rifle to his shoulder with a smoothness that surprised even himself, sighted down the barrel at a German soldier who was advancing toward a group of wounded British troops, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil kicked against his shoulder, the muzzle flashed bright in the smoke-filled air, and his target dropped with a finality that confirmed his shot had found its mark. He worked the bolt, ejected the spent cartridge, and fired again, and again, and again. Each shot was a declaration of intent, a refusal to be a victim, a transformation from prey to predator that the ancient warrior spirits would have recognized and approved. Sergeant O'Brien witnessed the change in the young recruit and felt a surge of pride, mixed with relief. He had seen men break under the pressure of combat, had watched promising soldiers dissolve into useless shells of terror, had wondered if Brennan would become another casualty of a mind unable to cope with the reality of war. But the boy, no, the man, for boys did not fire with such calm precision, had found something within himself, had access to reserve of strength that even Brennan himself had not known existed. Together, The three soldiers formed a nucleus of resistance that drew other scattered defenders to their position, creating a knot of firepower that stalled the German advance and bought precious time for the evacuees waiting on the beach. Colonel Whitmore, despite his wound, directed the defense with the expertise of decades, positioning men for maximum effect, calling out targets, maintaining the discipline that separated an organized fighting force from a panicked mob. The battle hung in the balance, the outcome uncertain, the cost measured in blood and lives, and the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, they might survive to see another sunrise. Frederick the Great had written that the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in combat. But no amount of training could have prepared these men for the crucible of Dunkirk. The German assault reached its peak as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the smoke-shrouded horizon. Enemy soldiers pressed forward with renewed determination, their officers screaming orders, their machine guns creating overlapping fields of fire that made movement nearly impossible. Colonel Whitmore took a second bullet, this one grazing his head and sending a sheet of blood cascading down his face. But he refused to fall, refused to abandon the men who looked to him for leadership in this hour of ultimate crisis. Sergeant O'Brien's ammunition ran out, and he resorted to using his rifle as a club, swinging the heavy weapon with devastating effect against any enemy soldier who came within reach. And Private Brennan, the recruit who had frozen, the boy who had become a man, found himself at the center of the defensive line, his rifle speaking with mechanical regularity, his mind operating in a state of calm focus that seemed to exist outside the chaos surrounding him. He no longer counted his kills, no longer thought about the faces of the men he was sending to their deaths, no longer experienced anything beyond the immediate requirements of survival and combat. He had become what the code had promised: steel, blade, weapon, and in becoming so, he had discovered a truth that would define the rest of his life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A squadron of RAF Spitfires appeared from the east, their engines roaring defiance at the German aircraft that had dominated the skies, their guns blazing as they dove upon the enemy dive bombers with lethal precision. For the first time since the evacuation began, the Luftwaffe was forced to defend rather than attack, their formation scattered by the aggressive British fighters, their bombs falling harmlessly into the sea rather than upon the crowded beach. Emboldened by this unexpected support, the British defenders launched a counterattack that caught the German infantry by surprise, driving them back from the positions they had so recently captured, restoring the perimeter that had seemed on the verge of collapse. Brennan found himself advancing alongside O'Brien and a dozen other soldiers, their bayonets fixed, their voices raised in a war cry that had echoed across battlefields for centuries, their feet pounding the sand as they charged toward an enemy that suddenly seemed less invincible, less terrifying, less capable of destroying the indomitable spirit of men who refused to surrender. Julius Caesar had conquered Gaul with the maxim that in war, events of importance are the result of trivial causes, and the trivial cause of this moment was a young recruit who had learned to overcome his fear. It is not the size of the dog in the fight, it is the size of the fight in the dog. Mark Twain darkness fell over the beach at Dunkirk, but the evacuation continued by the light of burning buildings and the occasional flare that arced across the sky like a fallen star. Private Brennan stood at the water's edge, helping wounded soldiers into the small boats that ferried them to the larger ships waiting offshore. His hands, which had trembled so uncontrollably that morning, now worked with steady efficiency, lifting men who could not walk, supporting those who could barely stand, offering words of encouragement that he had learned from Colonel Whitmore and Sergeant O'Brien. During the endless hours of combat, the colonel had been evacuated an hour earlier, his wounds too severe to allow him to continue fighting. But his last words to Brennan had been a nod of approval that conveyed more meaning than any medal or commendation ever could. "You found it," Whitmore had said, his voice weak but his eyes still burning with that pale blue intensity. "The steel, it was always there. You just needed someone to remind you." Those words echoed in Brennan's mind as he worked through the night, a mantra of transformation that he would carry with him for the rest of his long life. Sergeant O'Brien remained at his side, the two men working in wordless coordination, their bond forged in the fire of shared combat and mutual survival. The Irishman had told Brennan the truth about fear during a brief respite from the evacuation efforts, that it never truly went away, that even veteran soldiers felt its cold fingers before every battle, that the difference between a coward and a hero was simply the decision to act despite the terror that clawed at the edges of consciousness. Brennan understood now what those words meant, understood them not as abstract philosophy, but as lived experience, as visceral truth that had been burned into his soul by the crucible of Dunkirk. He thought of the young lieutenant who had died beside him, whose accusing eyes had added guilt to his paralysis, and silently vowed that he would never again fail to act when his comrades needed him. The war was far from over. France had fallen. Britain stood alone, and the darkness of Nazi tyranny threatened to extinguish the light of freedom across the entire continent. But Private Thomas Brennan, who had arrived at Dunkirk as a terrified recruit, would leave as something else entirely, a soldier who had stared into the abyss and discovered that he possessed the strength to stare back. The last boat departed as the first gray light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. Brennan and O'Brien were among the final soldiers to leave the beach, their boots splashing through water that was thick with oil and debris, their eyes fixed on the small fishing vessel that represented their ticket to survival. Behind them, the city of Dunkirk burned like a funeral pyre for the thousands who had not been so fortunate, who would remain forever on French soil, their sacrifice remembered by those they had helped to save. As the boat pulled away from the shore, Brennan looked back at the beach where he had experienced both his greatest failure and his most profound transformation, and he understood that war was not simply about killing enemies or capturing territory. It was about discovering who you truly were when everything else had been stripped away, when all pretense and illusion had been burned to ash, when only the fundamental core of your being remained. Desmond Doss, the medic who would later refuse to carry a weapon while saving dozens of lives under fire, understood this truth, that courage came in many forms, and that the greatest victory was the one you won against your own limitations. Brennan had won that victory, and though the battles ahead would test him again and again, he knew that he would never forget the code that had awakened the steel within him. The crossing to England took 7 hours, the small boat pitching and rolling in the channel swells, its cargo of exhausted soldiers sleeping where they sat or lay, their bodies finally surrendering to the demands of rest that they had denied for so long. Brennan did not sleep. He sat at the stern of the vessel, watching the coast of France recede into the distance, thinking about all that had happened and all that was yet to come. He thought about his parents, who would soon receive word that their son had survived when so many others had not. He thought about the colonel and the sergeant, the 2 men who had saved his life in different but equally important ways. He thought about the German soldiers he had killed, young men like himself who had families waiting for them, who had dreams and fears and hopes that would never be fulfilled. And he thought about the coast still remembers, understanding now that it was not magic, but simply a key that had unlocked something that had always existed within him, a strength that he had inherited from generations of ancestors who had faced their own battles and found the courage to persevere. The white cliffs of Dover emerged from the morning mist, and for the first time since arriving in France, Private Thomas Brennan allowed himself to believe that he might actually survive this war. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Winston Churchill, and so the recruit who froze under fire became the soldier who stood firm in the storm. The beaches of Dunkirk witnessed many miracles. During those desperate days of May 1940, the little ships that crossed the channel, the raft pilots who challenged the Luftwaffe's dominance, the discipline of men who waited patiently for rescue while death rained from above. But perhaps the greatest miracle was the one that occurred within the human heart, the transformation of terror into courage, of paralysis into action, of a frightened boy into a warrior, who would carry the lessons of that blood-soaked sand for the rest of his days. Colonel Whitmore's forgotten code still remembers was never officially recognized by the British military, never taught in training manuals or discussed in officer academies. But those who heard it, those who felt its power ignite something primal within their souls, understood that some truths transcend the boundaries of official doctrine. If this story has stirred something within you, if you feel the echo of that ancient call to courage reverberating in your own heart, then stay with us, subscribe to our channel, and remember, the steel is always there, waiting to be awakened. You need only find the key.